So where have we been the last couple of weeks? We've looked at, working our way through Scott's book, and we've looked at right-wing and left-wing anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism as represented by Professor Arthur Butts at Northwestern and Professor Stephen Thrasher at Northwestern. Although these are our representatives, they do stand for, especially in the case of the left wing, Professor Thrasher, really a large number of people across the academy. So we use them as our lens to look at these more general trends. We've been introduced to what a conspiracy theory is. You're familiar with the familiar ones, and we've now seen how their anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist theories are conspiracy theories. And then last week, we spent time doing some of the refuting. So I want to just zip through last week's slides. There were just a few because we were fortunate to have Scott with us for part of the session last time. So this is just a quick reminder of where we were last week. We spent some time refuting the key left-wing accusations against Israel of ethnic cleansing, genocide, settler colonialism, and apartheid. We spent some time going through some of Professor Thrasher's specific conspiratorial claims. We'll see a little bit more of those tonight. We looked at their views on the Holocaust. In effect, Butts obviously denies it. Thrasher does not, but both do accuse the Jews of abusing and exploiting it for their purposes. We spent a little time debunking the whole thing, as we need to do. Even if you think Holocaust denial is absurd, and it is absurd, you still need to be prepared to debunk it in the right conditions. And then I'd really like to emphasize this point again. In short, the right embraces and advocates for the Holocaust. They liked it when they're not busy denying it, whereas the left tends to love dead Jews, to use Dara Horn's very important phrase, and claims to mourn the Holocaust victims. They see the Nazis as terrible evil and the murders of 6 million as terribly, terribly evil things to do. But then the left condemns the Jews who escaped it as refugees to Palestine and treats them as white supremacist colonial genociders, affirms the horror of the episode, but doesn't draw the lesson that certainly many Jews did about the moral necessity of Israel. These conspiracy theories are not merely false theories, but crazy theories, upside down theories, as we went through last time, in particular with respect to race. On the right, Jews are not white at all. They're fake whites. Then on the left, Jews are even hyper white, European whites, in order to see them as white supremacists. This leads especially left-wingers to completely reverse the settler colonial paradigm, accusing Israeli Jews of being settler colonialists, when in fact the situation is exactly backwards. It's the Arabs who are the settlers, colonists, and the imperialists. And it's the Arabs who, in a true act of ethnic cleansing, expelled all their Jews, 800,000 Jews from most of the Arab countries, who then left as refugees and made it to Palestine or to Israel if they were lucky. And if anything, the case could be made, and indeed is made, that Israel is about the most legitimate country in the world, with historical foundations, legal foundations, moral foundations, and more. And so these left-wing charges aren't merely false, but outrageous and upside down. And that brings us to where we are today. The goal will be to go about 40 more minutes or so, and then happy to entertain questions or conversation. So we're up to chapter 6 of Scott's book. And what we note about these academic conspiracy theorist claims is their claims to objectivity, as Scott puts it colorfully, are tall tales. We observe what we might call the facade of academic credibility. Much of the anti-Israel work within the academy has this facade. They issue detailed reports with loads of footnotes in them. Arthur Butts's Holocaust denial book has hundreds of footnotes in it. They establish institutions such as the Institute for Historical Review, which sounds like a real academic society, and publishes, or at least did for, I don't know if it's still going, a regular journal that looks like an academic journal, but it's all the Holocaust deniers putting on this facade of academic legitimacy. They create an echo chamber effect, especially as the number of them increase, as these anti-Israel conspiracy theorists increase throughout the academy. they reaffirm each other and give each other legitimacy. So in particular, some academic presses, Duke University Press and Rutgers University Press come to mind most immediately, are just populated by anti-Israelists on their editorial boards. And when some anti-Israel academic writes a horrifically anti-Israel paper, it gets sent out to anti-Israel reviewers who, of course, pat it on the back and then go ahead and publish it. And so now you have what were formerly reputable academic presses, both Duke and Rutgers University, and they do publish other books that are okay, but because they populate the institution in this way, they get to publish all the anti-Israel stuff they want, however poorly suited it is to academic integrity, to the motto of Northwestern, as you recall, and the Golden Rule. It is possible to, in fact, it's necessary to puncture that credibility. However, it takes a lot of work, time, knowledge, expertise, but we need to do that. Elder of Zion, who I've mentioned several times, he is one of my favorite bloggers on issues related to Jews and to Israel. He periodically goes footnote chasing, as he sometimes refers to it. He actually looks at all the footnotes in these documents and checks out what they're referring to. And what he often discovers, he's written a number of articles about this, he discovers everything from quoting non-existing texts to misquoting existing texts to providing links to texts that don't actually support the point they are allegedly making, and so on. I gave you just one recent example. This is just from last month, where he tracked the footnotes on the UN Commission of Inquiry, one of their anti-Israel reports. And of course, we puncture the credibility by being able to refute these outrageous conspiracy theories that they are peddling. We already went through last time the refutations of ethnic cleansing, genocide, colonialism, and apartheid. We also discussed this Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, program called the Deadly Exchange, where they claim that that United States police departments who visited and did some training with Israeli police departments incorporate and imported Israeli racism back into the United States. So we've already debunked that. Here, I just want to add one point to that, which is to observe how the conspiracy theories work. This is a very typical modus operandus. They'll find some vague linkings and weave a theory around them. So this is the thinking in the mind of an anti-Semitic anti-Zionist. Well, we believe Zionists are racists. We believe the American police are racist. And look, a few American police groups did a little bit of training in Israel. Therefore, Israeli racism is imported into the United States. That's how the reasoning goes. And it's obviously ridiculous reasoning, but you take a link and you turn it into a conspiracy theory. Compulsory allegiance to Israel or conspiracy to silence anti-Zionists. As I mentioned last time, these folks are the loudest, most numerous people to consistently claim that they are being silenced. But what we have is a general trend here. They claim, sometimes some of them do get canceled. They do get silenced sometimes, and invariably they'll claim they're being canceled for criticizing Israel, or they're being canceled for advocating for Palestinian rights, when in fact, in the cases, the prominent cases, and we'll talk about a couple in a second, they're being canceled because they're horrifically anti-Semitic. So we have the case of Steven Saleta. He mentioned him previously. He was unhired from the University of Illinois in 2014, not because he was a critic of Israel, but because he was deemed to be a racist hater. Not to mention, he should have been not hired in the first place because his work does not live up to the motto and the rule, the norms of academic and moral integrity, but that wasn't the focus at the time. So, for example, here's a few of the things that he put out on social media and tweeted in the summer of 2014, leading to his unhire. He said, "You may be too refined to say it, but I'm not. I wish all the fucking West Bank settlers would go missing. You might remember the 2014 war between Hamas and Gaza started when Hamas kidnapped 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank and murdered them." So that's what he's referring to there. He's calling for the murder of all West Bank settlers, all West Bank Jews. Zionist, transforming anti-Semitism from something horrible into something honorable since 1948. I repeat, if you're defending Israel right now, then hopelessly brainwashed is your best prognosis. And lastly, just on my list. He's got more. At this point, if Netanyahu appeared on TV with a necklace made from the teeth of Palestinian children, would anybody be surprised? So we have him calling for the kidnapping and murder of Jews. We have him promoting, openly endorsing anti-Semitism. We have him saying that anyone who supports Israel is brainwashed and therefore devaluing the possibility of rational opposition to him. And most importantly, Netanyahu with the necklace made of the teeth of Palestinian children, a classic sort of blood libel that Israeli leader is somehow bloodthirsty. I don't think I need to point out to this crowd that none of that is criticism of Israel or advocating for Palestinian rights. It's just unadulterated Jew hate. So to the second case, more recent, Shema Dalali, if I've pronounced that correctly. She was, until very recently, the president of the National Union of Students, which is the largest student union in the United Kingdom. She was elected to that post about a year ago, by the way, after all of what I'm about to tell you was well known. So she wasn't elected despite what I'm about to say, but possibly because of what I'm about to say. She was just a couple of weeks ago, she was officially sacked from that position. She had been suspended from it a few weeks earlier because of her anti-Semitism, her racist bigotry against the Jews. She is now launching a whole campaign that she's being silenced for criticizing Israel and promoting Palestinian rights. Here's a couple of the things that she happened to say, a couple of many as well. She openly called for the murder of Jews by endorsing and calling for intifada, the two intifadas, in particular, the second intifada. As you know, well over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, many more thousands were maimed. Intifada is violent resurrection against Israeli Jews. She also prominently endorsed the traditional Islamic chant, Kebar, Kebar, Yahu, I won't go through it, Kebar, Kebar, which basically says, Jews remember Kebar. This was a battle back in Muhammad's time, which the Muslims massacred a large number of Jews. So Jews remember Kebar, the army of Muhammad is returning. This is what she's promoting, as well as glorifying various terrorist murderers of Jews. Every time there's a terrorist attack, she endorses the murderers. So let me say again, none of that is criticizing Israel. None of that is advocating for Palestinian rights. It's literally supporting, endorsing the murder of Jews. And she was therefore sacked. And what we have once again here, the way it's spun by the anti-Israelists is, of course, that Jews got them sacked in the same way that Jews are trying to cancel Kanye and Kyrie Irving and Dave Chappelle, et cetera, et cetera. Jews are canceling these people. And so what's happening, as we saw with the Ilhan Omar case, when Jews protest the bigotry against them, they're condemned for silencing people, right? So an absolutely ordinary activity, condemn or protest the bigotry that's being exercised against you. You are condemned for doing that. It's turned into something sinister. This brings us to the phenomenon of Jew washing. This is not Scott's term. I don't think he used this term, but he does talk about the phenomenon. I think the term is colorful and important, so I'll go ahead and use that term. Jew washing is modeled on, you've heard of some of the other washings, but the source of it is, of course, whitewashing. To whitewash something is to paint over the flaws or the sins or the crimes. If you whitewash something, that's become a whole industry now. So we've already talked about pink washing. This is the charge that when Israel's progressive agenda, that it's supportive of gay rights, the only country in the Middle East to be supportive of gay rights in any way, that they are just doing that to cover up their various crimes, the crimes of the occupation, etc. They call that pink washing. Greenwashing is what's the charge levied when Israel promotes or pursues and promotes its environmental agenda, which it does in many, many ways. And the whole point of these washing accusations is that, in fact, Jews in Israel can never do anything good. They can't have a good progressive agenda. They can't pursue environmental considerations. It's always something sinister. It's a cover-up for their crimes. So now we have Jew washing. This is something the other side does. We accuse them. I accuse them of Jew washing. you commit Jew washing when you try to hide or obscure your anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of your agenda or your own personal anti-Semitism, by pointing out that some Jews also agree with what you say. So anti-Zionists, the most prominent way they defend from the charge of anti-Semitism is by saying, but Jews, many Jews endorse this position too. So how can it be anti-Semitic? I can't be anti-Semitic if some Jews agree with me. It's an important phenomenon, and it's an important problem for people who stand up for the rights of Jews, that some number of Jews are actually on the other side, advocating for the other side. Jews have a long history of apostates who then become terrible persecutors of the Jews, going back into the medieval period. So this is nothing new, but it's a real phenomenon. I just want to point out, it's worth spending a few minutes reflecting on it and being aware of how it fails. Jew washing fails to eliminate the stain of anti-Semitism. So first of all, it's like the classic line, some of my best friends are Jews. The biggest sign that someone is an anti-Semite is that they vigorously remind you that some of their best friends are Jews. This speech, Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the Nazi SS, which was in charge of the final solution, oversaw and coordinated the murder of the many millions of Jews. He gave a speech to SS officers, and who are SS officers are the Naziest of the Nazis, right? These are the most committed, ideologically committed Jew haters who are on the front lines of the murders that constituted the Holocaust. He gave a speech to Nazi officers in 1943, where he's complaining that the efficiency of their murder program is being slowed down because too many of the officers want to make an exception for this Jew or that Jew. And here's what he says. He's talking about the quote, the extermination of the Jewish race. It's one of those things it's easy to talk about. The Jewish race is being exterminated, says one party member. That's quite clear. It's in our program, elimination of the Jews, and we're doing it, exterminating them. And then they come, Himmler continues, 80 million worthy Germans, and each one has his decent Jew. Of course, the others are vermin, they say, but this one, he's an A1 Jew. It's a very, very chilling moment to me, but it's a powerful moment, because what this shows is that even the worst Jew haters, SS officers and 80 million Germans in 1940s Germany, even the worst Jew haters can like some individual Jews. So the fact that some of your friends are Jews, or that you like some Jews, you hang out with some Jews, the fact that anti-Zionists include some Jews doesn't mean they aren't anti-Semites, any more than the fact that some Nazi officer has one guy he thinks is an A1 Jew means he isn't an anti-Semite. In fact, the percentage of anti-Zionist Jews is quite small. They're loud, but they are small. Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, represents probably no more than 5% of Jews, something like that. Most surveys show wide-scale support for or connection to Israel amongst Jews. You hear numbers like 80 to 95% of Jews feel supportive of Israel, depending on the phrasing of the question. And you obviously can't use a small minority as if it represents the large majority. All groups have internal dissent. So when an anti-Zionist says, look, we have a few Jews in our coalition, well, those few Jews represent the tiny minority of Jews. They hardly whitewash or Jew wash the anti-Semitism. What makes something anti-Semitic is its nature or its impact on the Jews, not necessarily who believes it. We're all familiar with the phenomenon of the self-hating Jew. So it doesn't matter if they're a Jew, they still might hate Jews. In fact, JVP lies all the time. Most recent example comes to mind. There was a doctor killed in a firefight with the IDF a few weeks ago, mid-October. And JVP put out all over their social media, basically, Israel killed a doctor who was tending to the wounded, as if he's deliberately targeting a doctor. In fact, that doctor was a terrorist engaging in a gun battle. He was armed. He was shooting. He wasn't doctoring. He was shooting. He was a member, I think it was of Fatah. He was a member of one of the armed military groups. And not only was there plenty of video confirming that he was killed while in a firefight as a terrorist with the IDF, not while doctoring and tending to a patient, Fatah openly claimed him as theirs. They gave him, one of their martyr funerals and wrapped him in their flag. So there was no secret of the fact that he was a terrorist. But JVP, fully knowing that, puts out on their social media that Israel killed a doctor who was tending to the wounded. The fact that they're Jewish, if they are, there's actually questions about that, but the fact that they're Jewish will be irrelevant here. This is just grossly anti-Semitic behavior. Lastly, Neturei Karta. I'll show you a picture of them in the next slide. You've seen them. These are they're an ultra-Orthodox sect. They are viciously anti-Zionist. They show up at lots of major anti-Zionist events. They go to Iran to participate in Holocaust denial conferences. So these are great Jew washers for the anti-Zionists because they look Jewish. They look like ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they're at the forefront of these anti-Israel rallies. What I'll say, and here they are, here's a picture of them. This was just a couple of years ago. The UN's, from Elder of Zion, UN's Israel-hating committee. So this is the UN General Assembly Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. So it's a whole committee that's devoted to bashing Israel in the UN. Put this on their Facebook cover. This is a couple of representatives in Neturei Karta, right? So this is just Jew washing right in our faces here. And the point to make here is, of course, I might argue that Neturei Karta are not anti-Semitic because their opposition to Israel ultimately comes from deep Jewish principles. They have a whole theory that Jews are not supposed to return to the land of Israel until the Messiah comes. The Messiah has not come. Therefore, what's happening is illicit. It's going against certain oaths in the Talmud. So there's a whole Jewish ideology here. It's a minority opinion, but Jews, as we know, have diverse opinions, and the Talmud even preserves minority opinions. So it comes from Judaism. Their opposition to Israel ultimately comes from Judaism. And so maybe they're not anti-Semitic, even if they hardly can be said to represent mainstream even Orthodox Judaism. But of course, the crucial thing is all the non-Jewish anti-Zionists, the people that populate our campus, their anti-Zionism doesn't come from Judaism. It comes from something else. So even if Neturei Karta escapes the charge of anti-Semitism because their hatred of Israel comes directly from Judaism, it's not going to exonerate their fellow anti-Zionists from that charge because they don't share the Judaic principles that support the anti-Zionism. To show the depth of this phenomenon, we're coming to the end of it. I think it's important to dwell on, as you can tell. This is a book that was published in 1936. This guy, Robert Gessner, went to Europe to see just how bad things were for the Jews. And then he wrote it up when he came back. And this is from a review in Time magazine of 1936. The book was called Some of My Best Friends Are Jews. And the part that, it's a fascinating book. And in terms of Jews who work for the other side, we'll just read the last part of this passage here. He found himself appalled at the conduct of the Association of German National Jews. This is in the mid-1930s. The Nazis are in power, right? And there's an Association of German National Jews. This organization supports Hitler, fights the Jewish boycott of German goods, and another group, the Nazi Jews. There was a group called the Nazi Jews, advocates complete loyalty to the Nazi program, and Gessner was told that they leave their meetings giving the Nazi salute, shouting, "Down with us." Chilling. It's just stunning, but believable. I don't know if that's confirmed by independent sources, but it's not implausible because there are always some Jews who go for the other side to the point where they would become Nazi Jews and end their meetings proclaiming, "Down with us." I think this issue is so important. I actually wrote a long four-part article on it. If you'd like to go check it out, this I think is the link to part one. I'm happy to share it with you after the session. I think it's really important to be aware of it. Okay. Moving on to chapter 7. How encounters with reality can inoculate against conspiracy theories. Scott, in following with obviously the theme of the motto and the rule, endorses such encounters with reality as he calls about them. If you care about the truth, you have to confront reality. That will include, for example, getting to know Israelis and Jews as actual human beings with the same needs and interests as most people, i.e., humanize them. Demonizing Israel is one of the classic techniques of the anti-Zionists, but reality involves getting to know them and humanizing them. And that's also part of what the Golden Rule demands, to treat the other as you would want to be treated. So go to Israel, see the racial and ethnic diversity there, both within the Jewish community there and just within the non-Jewish community there as well. Study the history, study the archaeology, study Jewish people's indigeneity in the land, study the history of the Muslim imperial conquests, and so on. You need to learn the facts in order to resist temptation by these conspiracy theories. It's no surprise that campus anti-Zionism, one of the big trends right now, is called normalization. Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, and their related groups regularly have campaigns that you cannot normalize with Zionists. That means you can't talk to them, you can't entertain them, you can't allow them to speak, you must boycott any classes that either they teach or are present in. Right now, as we speak, just this past week, SJP at University of Chicago has launched another boycott of 3 particular classes that are taught by visiting Israeli professors. And these are very innocuous classes. One of them, I think, has to do with the conflict. The other 2 don't. But simply because these are Israelis, students should not be in their presence, be exposed to them, et cetera, et cetera. That this violates academic norms couldn't be clearer. That violates the motto, and the rule couldn't be clearer. But this is the prominent strategy now. So to resist it, obviously, go meet those Israelis, go take their classes, listen to what they have to say. This takes us, a nice quote from Scott. Peace will have to be negotiated between both sides, but it will never come by fabricating a false history. So knowing the facts, knowing the truth is obviously essential to responding to these conspiracy theories. This takes us to part 3 of the book, which is looking at, so we've looked at what their conspiracy theories are. We've looked at how to refute them in some detail. Part 3 continues the really meaty substance of the book by showing where these conspiracy theories came from and how they got entrenched in the academy in the first place. Very important information in this part of the book. Chapter 8. Right. So in short, Scott shows how today's right-wing conspiracy theories derive directly from Nazi conspiracy theories. Not a surprise, that one. Little, maybe less well known, is that today's left-wing conspiracy theories derive directly from Soviet conspiracy theories. So if Butts is just following in the Nazi tradition, quite clearly, Thrasher is just following in the Soviet tradition. Recognizing these sources, that these theories just came out of those sources, is truly essential to understanding that it's the same old anti-Semitism dressed up in new anti-Zionist clothing. Nobody doubts that the Nazis and the Soviets, if you know a little bit about the history of Soviet Union and of Russia, nobody doubts that these countries and these populations were viciously, viciously anti-Semitic. So in seeing how these places are the sources of today's theories, we see how that anti-Semitism gets repackaged into anti-Zionism. In effect, they're fighting today, they're fighting the same evil Jewish power that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was all about, only now it's in the guise of Israel. They still see themselves. Today's theories are just new ways of fighting the same Jews they were fighting around the time of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In fact, I would argue this will be a little bit controversial, but by and large, the left doesn't really care, though it supports the Palestinians. It's not because they particularly care about the Palestinians. They care about destroying the Jews. I would argue that. They will say they support the Palestinians, but that's an instrument or a means to destroy the Jews, I would argue. And I have a piece I've written about that as well. I'm happy to share if you get in touch with me. Okay, that's the overview of the sources of these conspiracy theories. Regarding the right wing, we'll be very brief here. Just Butts really comes right out of the Nazi and neo-Nazi tradition. There's literally a straight line from the Nazis to Butts. That won't surprise anybody. The left wing is a little bit more nuanced, but ultimately, Scott shows that there's a straight line from Soviet anti-Semitism to Soviet anti-Zionism to as a primary example, Angela Davis, an important political activist and academic now, to Stephen Thrasher. So he traces the route that Soviet anti-Semitism takes into the left-wing anti-Zionist theories as represented by Thrasher. It's well known there's a long history of communist and Soviet opposition to, or I would say hatred of, Judaism. This goes back to Marxist anti-Semitism. Marx himself and Marxist theory are profoundly anti-Semitic. Just read his famous essay on the Jewish question to get a little taste of that. And obviously Marxism becomes Soviet communism. This combines with what was already a deep-rooted Russian anti-Semitism. And produces open efforts in Russia in the 19th century into the 20th century and then into the Soviet Union, open efforts to suppress, purge, pogrom Jews, and destroy Jewish identity. This is part of the Russian Soviet plan. You remember, Protocols of the Elders of Zion was produced in Russia. You perhaps are aware of the famous Kishinev pogrom in 1903, which was a particularly vicious pogrom. Some hundreds were murdered and many more injured, women raped, things like that. But this was actually just one pogrom of many. There was a whole series of pogroms from the 1880s onwards. This continued into World War I, where there were Russian massacres of entire Jewish villages. So we have decades and decades of literally open Russian and then Soviet violence towards Jews. In 1918, the Jewish section, so this is after the revolution, Russia has become communist. The Jewish section of the Communist Party was created with the aim of, quote, destruction of traditional Jewish life, of the Zionist movement, and of Hebrew culture. This was the Jews of the Communist Party. So, you know, talk about the Jews on the other side. These were Jews who were dedicated to destroying Jewish life, Zionist movement, and Hebrew culture, and calling for its total liquidation. By the 1950s, after World War II, Soviet propaganda was openly and, in fact, strategically anti-Zionist. Again, it's part of the same, they're still fighting the Jews per the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but now the Jews have managed to create a state, so they're fighting that state because they're fighting the Jews. It also was part of their Cold War against the West. Allying with the Arabs was part of the battle against Western imperialism. And there's the Soviet Union complaining about Western imperialism. The Soviet Union is, of course, an imperialist entity. They believed the Arabs would be more docile and controllable clients, plus the Arabs had the oil. So there were also Cold War strategic considerations that just simply allied with the unadulterated need to fight the Jews, hatred of the Jews. So from the Soviets, yes, again, we get the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, including the idea that international Jewry is a movement of Jewish supremacy that aims to control and dominate the world and is thus a threat to the whole world. And it does this by controlling capitalism, banks, media, governments, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you, Soviets. Thank you, Russians. The KGB, the spy agency of the Soviets, and the Soviet Department of Propaganda produced this stuff under the heading of Zionology. And I just want to read you an entry for Zionism. This is from, Scott quotes it, in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. They say the following in this entry, that the main posits of modern Zionism are militant chauvinism, racism, anti-communism, anti-Sovietism. The anti-human reactionary essence of Zionism is an overt and covert fight against freedom movements and against the USSR. International Zionist Organization owns major financial funds through Jewish monopolists and collected by Jewish mandatory charities, and it influences or controls significant parts of media agencies and outlets in the West. And finally, Zionism serves as the front squad of colonialism and neo-colonialism. International Zionism actively participates in the fight against national liberation movements of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So that should sound familiar. That's Protocols of the Elders of Zion, where they're essentially just substituting the word Zionist for the word Jew. It's exactly the same propaganda, the all-powerful Jewish Israel lobby that's pulling the strings, threatening the entire world, and so forth. The exact same conspiracy theory from Protocols from the Elders of Zion. And as you see this phraseology here, and start looking at contemporary left-wing anti-Zionists such as Thrasher, you'll see the words are nearly the same. They're using exactly the same sort of language. The settler colonialism paradigm is coming straight from the Soviet propaganda, which comes straight from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So there's a straight line here from Soviet anti-Semitism to Soviet anti-Zionism, which becomes the political platform of the Soviet Union. I want to insert this slide here. This is, Scott doesn't address this, but I'm just calling your attention to it. There's significant evidence that, in fact, the Soviets are just behind the entire Palestinian liberation movement, behind the PLO. And I'm happy to maybe address that further in questions or outside the webinar, but that the KGB created the PLO, handpicked the original members, helped draft the charter, trained Yasser Arafat to take it over, that there was a deliberate strategy coordinated by the Soviet Union to reframe the narrative from destroy Israel. And that was the initial narrative, right? These scrappy Jews are fending off all these Arabs who were bigger and stronger than they were. And their goal was a war of annihilation, a war of extermination, Holocaust 2.0. That was more or less the language they used in 1948. So the narrative then was that the Israelis were the vulnerable people and the Arabs were the enormous party. Israeli was David to the Arabs Goliath. The Soviets explicitly recraft that from destroying Israel, because that doesn't sound very nice, to turning it into a struggle for human rights, a struggle to liberate the oppressed Palestinian people, which involved essentially inventing the Palestinians as a people. They're no longer Arabs, they become the Palestinians. And now you reframe it as Israel is oppressing the indigenous homeless Palestinians, and suddenly the Palestinians look like David and Israel looks like the Goliath. This is a deliberate Soviet strategy. Creating the PLO is part of that strategy, and it's all an extension of protocols of the Elders of Zion fighting the Jews. It's all about destroying the Jews. Very, very scary stuff. In the mid-1970s, Soviets began flooding the Islamic world with Arabic translations of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it still sells widely to this day as if it's a book of fact, all from the Soviets. So how do we get from the Soviets to Thrasher? I'll mention a book in a moment that documents quite a bit of this. Scott also does some of this. After World War II, left-wing Marxism rises and spreads in the American and European Academy. There are a number of examples, but the key one to focus on is this woman, Angela Davis. I'll show you her picture in just a second. She provides the direct line from Soviet propaganda into the American Academy, introducing the anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the Soviet Union into the Academy, and going on to influence younger scholars like Thrasher, who explicitly cites and adores her, as a matter of fact. So Angela Davis swallows the whole Soviet narrative. She spreads the idea of Zionism as a racist, Western imperialist, colonialist, fascist movement. Throw on every bad word you can there, right? And just think about these terms: imperialist, colonialist, fascist. Of course, that's the Soviet Union, but they're weaponizing this and claiming that little tiny Israel is guilty of that. Angela Davis is openly Marxist and communist, and she just uses all the classic tropes, including referring to the Israel lobby as this all-powerful Elders of Zion group, and supports all the anti-Israel causes. So there's straight line from Soviet anti-Semitism to its anti-Zionism to Angela Davis to Thrasher. And ultimately, it is this left-wing ideology that is pervasive throughout the Academy, updated today in the guise of critical race theory or Black women's gender studies, intersectionality, wokeness. There's a lot of terms, there's a lot of overlapping things, but this whole package of conspiracy theories is now part of the left-wing Academy under these sorts of labels here. And although, as we've said, Butz's right-wing anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism isn't very present in the universities, the key insight of Scott's book and putting it next to Thrasher's is to see that Thrasher's version, these are just flip sides of the same coin. It's easy to recognize the right-wing anti-Semitism for what it is. Harder to recognize the left-wing anti-Zionism, but by putting them next to each other and seeing that they're both conspiracy theories, and as we're about to now see, overlap in so many ways, the hope is the clear, vile, anti-Semitic nature of the right wing will just be seen as clearly applying to the left wing. So there's Angela Davis. That's her Wikipedia, always the beginning of her Wikipedia page. This ideology is everywhere in the academy now, and it's growing. It's a very frightening phenomenon. Scott does discuss several other Northwestern professors who adopt basically the whole platform, the whole program, including one at Northwestern's Qatar campus, who teaches blood libels as facts and openly supports Hezbollah and so forth. He talks about the Jasbir Puar case. This is an interesting one. She's a professor at Rutgers University. A good example of someone passing work off as serious academic work that is easily shredded. Carrie Nelson, for example, has shredded her work from an academic perspective. She's an important source of the pinkwashing charge against Israel. She wrote a book claiming that Israel has a policy of deliberately maiming Palestinians and attempting to stunt their growth. And when it does kill them, Israel harvests their organs and uses them for, I think, medical research or probably medical research, etc. All of which are just demonstrably false. They are utterly defamatory, slanderous libels. It's a mockery of the academy that this could get published in an academic book. Puar herself has admitted it doesn't matter if her claims are true. She says they stretch the speculative into the now. Not quite sure what that means, other than it's a way of saying, even if they're false, I don't know, what does that mean? They stretch the speculative into the now. Doesn't matter if they're true. That's the crucial part there. Talk about violating the motto and the rule. Her book won a prize from the Women's Studies Association. That's how wonderful they thought it was. That is a reflection of how this movement has taken over large swaths of the academy. Many entire departments, anthropology, women's studies, gender studies are very, very nasty sources of a lot of this. This is where a lot of the BDS resolutions come from in academic associations. It's also taking over much of mainstream media and even many Jewish organizations today. So when you hear about wokeness or anti-racism, the way that word's used today, many Jewish organizations are going pretty all in on it. But ultimately, and this is a separate side point that's worth studying, the anti-racist agenda as it's promulgated today is very bad for the Jews. It sees the Jews, as Thrasher does, as white supremacists oppressing people, benefiting from unearned privilege and oppressing others. It produces Kanye West. It produces Kyrie Irving and Dave Chappelle, this anti-racism ideology. The point I'm making now is straight line, Soviet anti-Semitism to Soviet anti-Zionism to Angela Davis to left-wing academia to anti-racism to bad for the Jews. It's all part of this business here. Just a few books and then we'll wrap up. So these are some very good books on the left-wing anti-Zionist takeover of the academy and more. Carrie Nelson on the upper left is a real hero. He's not afraid to engage academically with every one of these anti-Israel activists and refute their work. Joshua Moravchik, this is an excellent book showing how really the Western world in general has turned against Israel from 1967 onwards, the victory in the Six-Day War, important victory, but it also marks a pivot, unpleasant pivot. He documents the academy as well. And most recently, this is a quite new book from David L. Bernstein, Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms the Jews. If you choose one on this list, I would recommend that last one because it is talking about today. It is talking about the problem today, including Jewish organizations who are, he argues, adopting an ideology which is antithetical to the Jews. And this book's also, it's pretty short and very, very readable, so I do recommend it. Lastly, a couple of conservative books that are documenting this general phenomenon that we're talking about. One from Ben Shapiro, the other one from Mark Levin. These are very prominent people. I'm sure you're familiar with them. What we'll do next time, we'll wrap up here. We'll focus next time on how the right and the left are becoming indistinguishable from each other. They're doing it themselves. Scott's book helps us see that they're indistinguishable, that they're two sides of the same coin. But in fact, in practice now, right and left are holding hands in their attack on the Jews. And we'll look at a bunch of examples as listed on this slide. We'll look through a bunch of examples and we'll ask ourselves, all right, is this a right-wing anti-Semite who's responsible for this or a left-wing anti-Semite? And we won't be able to tell because they're becoming indistinguishable from each other. The bad news is there's a lot of them and they're against the Jews. They're against us. The good news is, if there is good news, it's might allow more people to begin seeing how left-wing anti-Zionism just is right-wing anti-Semitism in slightly different clothing. And that hopefully will be the beginning of a battling back, enabling people, empowering people, motivating people to really fight back against that movement. So come back next time, which will be 2 weeks from tonight, and we will go through these examples and more. So Joel, I'll turn to you if that's okay. And if you want to moderate and pick out some of the questions. And again, if we don't get to your question, please, andrewpessin.com. You can contact me through my website. I'm happy to continue to engage.
Evan, to a couple of the questions that people have, and I also have some questions myself. But the first question is from an anonymous attendee, and I'm gonna decipher a question out of this. So I think they're asking, why do neo-Nazis and Nazis in America deny the Holocaust? And isn't that counterproductive to their ideology and the arguments they want to make?
That is a good question. Why do they deny the Holocaust? I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but, you know, they often deny the Holocaust and also praise it, right? And want to repeat it and praise Hitler and things like that. So we shouldn't necessarily expect a logical, rational answer to that, because these are not necessarily rational, logical people. They're driven by hatred. And when you're driven by hatred, what you do, hatred of the Jews, what you do is attack the Jews every way you can, any way you can. And one way to attack them is to claim that they're responsible for this enormous hoax, the Holocaust hoax, and how evil are they because they're manipulating all of humankind and we have to fight them. So it doesn't matter if it's true, as Jaspir Puer just said, a left-wing academic at Rutgers University. It doesn't matter if it's true. So they deny the Holocaust because that can be weaponized against the Jews. But then other times they praise Hitler and say Hitler, you know, didn't finish the job. It's time to finish the job. But what job? If you say that job didn't happen, what job are you talking about? Doesn't matter. Sometimes they want to actively attack the call for killing Jews. Other times they want to just attack Jews for being, you know, malicious manipulators. So that's the best I have on that really interesting question. Thank you.
They're inconsistent. I think they're just kind of lost in their hatred.
Yeah.
Touching on, you know, the inception of Russian Soviet anti-Semitism, Soviet anti-Zionism, and kind of the modern reiteration of Zionism as racism, and you especially see that on campus. How do you see how that's evolved, or in your terms, how has that evolved over the last 30, 40 years? And how often are they still relying on Soviet propaganda to promulgate anti-Zionism on campus?
That's a great question too. Thank you. I'm just writing it down so I don't forget it while I start talking. And how do they still invoke it? I actually want to add one more thing to the previous question, which I thought of while you were giving me this question, although I was listening, multitasking. Shay, Scott points out, and Deborah Lipstadt also points out that from the beginning, even Arthur Butts, the Holocaust denial was also part of a program to delegitimize Israel, because the perception was, after the Holocaust, a lot more people understood we needed to create Israel. So if you hate Israel, denying the Holocaust is a way of making Israel illegitimate. It never happened, so you don't need the state. So I think that's one other component of it. So, but now back to this question. I don't know that I could answer how it's evolved. But as I follow today's left-wing progressive movement, they are in many ways openly, they still endorse communism and socialism. These are very prominent value systems for them. I don't know that they typically cite Soviet propaganda anymore. I don't know if that's like explicitly in the mix, but certainly the Marxism, socialism, communism that evolved through the Soviet Union is very much in the mix. That's regularly referred to. And the language they're using remains that Soviet language. When you see Israel accused of being settler, colonial, imperialist, Western, fascist, all of those comes right out of the Soviet propaganda. So my guess is most of the people using those words today, that includes the professors and especially the students who just, shout these phrases from left to right, SJP, and everything they do, they repeat those phrases. I'm sure they have no idea that those ultimately trace back to Soviet propaganda and trace back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion ultimately. But they don't need to anymore. If any, that might, I don't know, that might devalue that language if they saw where it came from. They don't know and they don't care. They just use it, which is why I think Scott's chapter here is just such an important contribution, because when you find yourself using a slogan that, Soviet anti-Semites used, it looks bad, right? So to see the origin of this expression, that, just there was I think another horrific episode. Speaking of Northwestern, in fact, I emailed Scott about it and he was aware of it, but I won't go into the details. But a few days ago, a Jewish student published a very heartbreaking op-ed about feeling attacked on campus as a Jew and as a Zionist. And she particularly called out the expression "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and said that crosses a line for her. That is a statement that basically comes out of the Hamas charter, which is a genocidal anti-Semitic group. It openly calls for the murder of all Jews in their charter. I kid you not. So that's their slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And we all know what it means. It means ethnic cleansing of Jews out of Palestine. That's what they're calling for. So she published this op-ed. It was very painful. And then SJP responded by taking something like 40 copies of her op-ed, gluing them together, and then on an enormous sign, spray painting in blood red, "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," over her op-ed, and then posting it prominently on campus, directly targeting her. What's the point of that? To me, when you realize that this slogan, "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," is Hamas propaganda that's part of a document that calls for the murder of Jews, you should be embarrassed saying that slogan. SJP, to the contrary, doubled down. But the hope is the more decent people, the ones who are shouting, kids who are shouting these slogans on campus, they don't necessarily know what they mean and they don't know where they come from. And the hope is at least a few of them, when they realize what they're shouting is something a Hamas terrorist might shout, maybe that will give them some pause. So it's important to recognize the source of these ideas and the sources of these slogans in order to taint them, hopefully, in order to taint them and diminish them. Even if today, I don't think anybody ever quotes or cites the Soviet sources. I hadn't even heard of the thing that I just read out of Scott's book about this encyclopedia, the Zionology. That was new to me. And yet I'm aware of all the stuff that's being said today that echoes that text. So the original source sort of disappears, but it lives on in the mouths of the ideologists.
I think that was a great answer.
Thank you.
Especially on the idea of Soviet propaganda. Obviously, I don't think that many of the anti-Israel activists and the Zionists understand the roots of the materials and the language that they're using in their activism. But it's there, and it's unfortunate. And you're also seeing anti-Semitism creep into a lot of other aspects of life right now. anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Obviously, have been popularized, and we've heard about it from specific members of pop culture over the last couple
Yeah.
months. So I'm actually going to leave you with the last word. Before I prompt you on what that's going to be, I'm just going to thank everyone here for joining us. As always, it's been wonderful learning with you about investigating modern conspiracy theories. We will be back at the same time on November 30th, so 2 weeks from today, and we'll be joined by Dr. Andrew Pessin as well. So Andrew, how about you close us out? Maybe touch a little bit on the environment of anti-Semitism that's been occurring right now, and maybe give us a lasting thought.
So again, those who didn't get questions, a chance to get posed, please feel free to reach out to me. I think what's dominant right now, I mean, just even in the last couple of weeks, it's just getting, the wave is bigger and bigger and bigger with more celebrities, with the ones I mentioned already, Kyrie and Kanye and Dave Chappelle, etc. It's coming from every direction, right, left, up, down, in, out. And it's just a massive wave of Jew hatred. That's the only thing I can say about it. I do think I'm becoming more convinced. I've just read David L. Bernstein's book that I mentioned, so I'll give it those props once more. I do think the wave of anti-racism, which has swept the country, which has some important, virtuous, good thing at its core, for sure, has also become allied with a platform of Jew hatred. And that has put the Jews in a very, very difficult position, because if you want to stand up for Jews, Jewish rights, Jewish equality, even Jewish freedom from harassment and physical attack, in fact, if you want to stand up for that, you now have to be against the anti-racist movement as it's currently going, which means if you're anti-racist, you must be racist. So the other side has completely sort of won I'll call it the propaganda war, or they've controlled the narrative, or they're controlling the rhetoric, because their position is the one that's anti-racist. Anyone who resists it must be a racist. But anti-racism is also anti-Jewish, as it's turned out now. So what can the Jews do? It's a really difficult position we are in at this particular juncture. Happily, on the last session and the end of the book, Scott does give some positive recommendations, things he thinks we can do. So I have a couple weeks to think more about that question and try to end on a happier note. But from where it looks to me right now, we're in a very, very tenuous, difficult position where not only are we being attacked from every direction, but our very efforts to push back and resist that attack are condemned as racist. That's like, both hands and both legs tied behind our back and just take the assault. So hopefully on our last session 2 weeks from now, we'll end with some positive ideas, and I'll try to find an optimistic outlook to end with.